Today is Tuesday, December the 5th, 2017. We're in Ponderosa Annex C on West Mall at UBC, the old writing centre. My name is Herbert Rosengarten, and I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Sally Thorne, who is a professor in the School of Nursing at UBC.
Yes.
And Associate Dean in the Faculty of Applied Science, which is something that's always puzzled everybody I've ever spoken to about this. Why is the School of Nursing in the Faculty of Applied Science?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. The School of Nursing was the first university-based degree-granting program in the British Empire at the time, in 1919, when Ethel Johns, who was the director of the VGH School of Nursing and director of nursing at VGH, was able to convince the government of the day that the way to solve public health problems was to have a knowledgeable nursing workforce. So this was in a time after World War I, when nurses had hit the press for the first time probably in Canada as having an impact. And then immediately when they came back, there was a worldwide Spanish flu epidemic. So the conditions were right. The idea of an educated nursing workforce had some appeal, and she was able to get UBC historically into this. She's become a person of national historic significance in Canada since. So the school has this amazing history, and they didn't know what to do with nursing. There was arts and science, and they knew it wasn't that. There was agriculture, and they were fairly sure it wasn't that. The only other option was applied science, which is fascinating because at that time, it was 50 years later that nursing really was credited as having any scientific basis. Even though Florence had done the epidemiological work, it was considered a bit of a fluffy issue. So it was put there in 1919. The Senate record is very clear that it was a placeholder. It was going to change when the appropriate thing came along. And about every 10 years since that time, there's been discussion in Senate or a royal commission or some kind of a consultation, and it has never changed. So.
And the nurses themselves, haven't they voted from time to time or indicated that they want to stay in the Faculty of Applied Science?
Well, as a school, back when the university really understood the distinction between a department and a school, the school had considerable autonomy. So the director of the School of Nursing always had a direct line to government and that sort of thing, because of course there's two ministries involved. And so it operated in a semi-autonomous way. And I was director of the School of Nursing for almost a decade. That implies a leadership role in the health community as well. So an engineering dean wouldn't ever presume to tell nursing how to run itself. So there was a little bit of safety in that regard.
Yes.
And there have been, over the past decade or decade and a half, there have been some politics. There have been some times when it seemed like it would come out of applied science, but I think it's back there firmly to stay, and probably for the first time in all of its history actually capitalizing on that connection between the way in which engineers think and planners and architects and landscape architectures and thinking about cities and healthy cities and how things work and sustainable.
These are common interests.
Oh, much more. And we're all doing something on behalf of the world, so there's very much an ethos that's similar.
Well, on those grounds, you should be members of the English department. But I won't pursue that. Let's get back to you, Sally. Can you tell us when and where you were born?
I was born in England in 1951. My dad went over to have a one-year lecture opportunity at Imperial College. He was a master's prepared engineer and got very excited and decided to stay on and do his PhD. So I think the negotiation with my mom, they were newlyweds when they went over, was that he could only stay if she got to have a baby. So I was it.
I see.
And my brother came along. So I was a little English baby, and then we came back to Canada.
So, and how old were you when you came back?
2.
So you did effectively all your growing up in
Yes.
Canada. And where did you grow up?
First, we were in Nova Scotia, and I think when I was about 5, we came back to Toronto, and Dad took up a position at University of Toronto where he stayed for the rest of his career. He ultimately was the Dean of Engineering at University of Toronto. So I grew up in an engineering department, which is quite fun because I know the species well, and so it's actually been very, very interesting to be in a university in which engineering and nursing work so closely together.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, so
and you went to primary and secondary school in Nova Scotia?
No,
in Toronto.
yeah.
And then How about university?
I went to nursing school in a hospital program, Toronto Western Hospital, and I was going to have nothing to do with universities. This was the 60s, and, don't trust anybody over 30, and education's all plot. So I was enjoying my life, but I really was drawn by the, go west, young woman thing, and decided that I would treat myself. I really didn't think I'd have anything to do with universities, but I decided to come out to UBC for 1 year and just take psychology. I'd been working in mental health at the time. So it was a year of indulgence to just enjoy being a university student once, so I could know what it was like and know why I wasn't doing it. And came out in 1976 and got absolutely hooked.
So you came out to study?
For 1 year, just for 1 year.
Yeah.
I actually talked my way into second year psychology courses because I had mental health background, so I had some reading in the field. I could argue that, but I loved it, and so I decided if I was going to justify staying, I ought to go and do the degree completion in nursing. So I had to fight my way into nursing.
Yeah. So you were an RN, and then you went on to complete your degree.
Yes.
And then you came. Did you come back to Vancouver then, or did you complete your degree?
I stayed. I came out here to do that and never left. So. I didn't expect that was how it was going to go, but I kept, getting more and more degrees over time, and then.
So tell us a little bit about your time as a student here, completing a degree.
Oh, it was wonderful. That was a time in which actually I was a member of the Women's Centre at UBC, and it was quite a lively political environment. There was lots of tension between the Engineering Undergraduate Society that had Lady Godiva ride at that time and the Women's Centre. So I was involved in several of those, I wouldn't call them riots, but definitely kerfuffles in which people were smashed around, and the lineups at the Student Health Services Hospital afterward were pretty long. There's lots of press about that, and I've actually found some clippings. But it was a wonderfully contentious time. But I also got myself involved as the Secretary of SAC, so I was involved in student government and had an office with. Some people who became prominent politicians later on, shall we say, were all at the same time in that. So I had a little bit of a taste for what student government was like.
Who was president at the time? Can you remember? I don't mean
that. I can't remember.
I don't mean administration. I mean the student president, the people.
That I don't remember. No, I remember Mosa Hoda and Herb Dollywall and people like that in student government at the time.
Yeah.
Tim Stevenson was a colleague at that time. So there, some people who went on to have careers that would be known in the local community.
Yeah.
No,
but you remember the Lady Godiva ride, obviously.
Oh, I do that. I do. The other very wonderful memory I have is at that time, the senior administration would invite student government to some dinners, and what they would have on the table that would be most fascinating for a student was a sort of a big brandy snifter that would be full of cigarettes. At the end of the evening, they'd sort of, now you take all of those, they'd pass them all out to the students. That was the table decoration of the time.
I guess that must have been around the time of
the 70s.
That would have been Doug Kenny, George Peterson.
Yes.
And then after him, Bob Smith briefly, and then Dave Strangway.
Then Dave Strangway, yes.
Yeah. So you would have worked with all of those in one way or another.
Yeah.
So you finished your nursing degree in what, late 70s?
79, and then I was a lecturer for about 20 months and got encouraged to come back in the master's program. This is before there were doctoral programs in Canada in nursing. So I got a university graduate fellowship and happily I felt I was rich and went into the master's program. Loved it to bits. So it was a 2-year full-time program at that time. And when I came out, came on faculty. And then I didn't finish my PhD for another, I took it about 5 years later or something like that, and took a 12-month study leave and finished off my PhD.
So you must have been a student here with people who taught you and then subsequently became your colleagues.
Yes.
So who were the...
And some of those people I ended up, eventually became the director and therefore their boss, so it was...
Can you remember any particular people who who really struck you when you first came as a visitor and then as a student?
there were so many characters in the School of Nursing at that time, absolutely. The Muriel Pritchard was the director of the School of Nursing, and she was a different sort of person. She would turn up to work in her bedroom slippers and all kinds of interesting things that students would be quite fascinated by. And then there was a transition. Beth McCann was in for about 4 years, and I knew Beth much better than I knew Muriel. And then Marilyn Wilman arrived, and Marilyn's still living. She was the director then for 17 years, so you had a director term for life till that point, until you retired.
Yes.
But they were all characters, and I had the opportunity to work with such interesting people. They were the two that come to mind that were probably most influential were probably more at the master's level than at the baccalaureate level. But one was Margot Campbell, who was an absolutely fine mind, absolutely brilliant thinker, very sort of peaceful, quiet thinker, and she didn't write a whole lot in her career, but a lot of people who were her students went on to write. She used the eraser end more than the pencil end, we used to say, but very, very fine. And another was Rosemary Campbell, who was a fierce dragon lady type who pushed really hard, just the absolute personality opposite of Margaret Campbell, quite fierce. She didn't suffer fools, and she could always see a level in which you could improve. So she had lots of students in tears, but I came to really appreciate her, and she became a mentor in time. So very interesting.
So around that period, I guess, the facilities were undergoing change, weren't they?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what it was like before and after?
Well, nursing's never had a building. Just put that on the map as part of the story, because it's an interesting part. When I first came to the school, we were still in the Westbrook building, had some space there, and my office was in one of the frat houses on Toronto Road. So that was where I began. It was actually very nice because it had a kitchen, the group of offices, and there was a kitchen and a bathroom. You could take a bath or a shower, and lots of things that don't normally come with an office suite. So there was a folksiness to it, but it wasn't really all that well suited. In 1980, which would be before I went to do my master's program, well, during the time I was a lecturer, we moved into the third floor of what's now the acute care hospital. And at that time it was intended to be a community hospital, so it seemed like a really good idea to have nursing on that third floor. But it was there as temporary space.
Yes.
And there we sit. So we have been there since that time.
It's still your space.
Yes, and it's still part of the story of nursing, because of course we're getting close to 2019, which will be the 100th anniversary of nursing being on this campus. And President Ono is well aware that we expect that there will be very serious plans about a building by that time. Only takes 100 years. And if you come to visit, the physical facilities of the School of Nursing are among the worst on this campus. And they haven't had a new broom closet. They haven't expanded. There hasn't been new space since 1980. It's a world-class, research-intensive academic nursing program, consistently ranked in the top 20. And when visitors come, they're stunned, because it's sort of like converted what was originally designed as hospital space up there on the third floor. The offices are configured more like parts of what would have been a patient room. So it's quite interestingly bad facilities, and people are quite shocked. But people continue to do good work there, so it's been a lot of fun. So we actually have a lot of fun with it, and each new president that comes along and each new dean, we sort of, what are you going to do about the building? But there will eventually be a proper building for nursing, and in some ways something may be lost, because the story about being here 100 years and not having a building, is a source of pride.
As I was going to say, it's part of the aura of being a nurse at UBC.
Yeah. It is.
Have no real home.
No real home, yeah. And we capitalize on it and get some mileage
But
out of it.
you all work in the hospital at once?
No.
You don't work in the hospital at all?
No. For 25 years, nurses have not worked in the hospital. It's a research hospital. It's very few of our students. Our students have never had first dibs, for example.
Yeah.
The Langara students might get higher privilege, So the world is very democratic in healthcare, and having to sort that out. So our students have never had first dibs on any of the university hospitals, and a very small percentage of our students have ever found their way into a clinical placement there. So
That's really interesting.
Yeah. So
I think we all just assumed.
Of course. Well, one would.
So where do your nurses go for practicum purposes?
Everywhere.
Yeah.
They need to be able to go way out the Fraser Valley, down to Peace Arch, up Squamish, all around the province. It's clinical placements are very, very difficult. So the training of a nurse requires that you have appropriate clinical placements and clinical preceptors and educators in certain places. A lot of moving parts, which is why the director role is something different than just an academic department head role. It's very much a negotiation in the healthcare system kind of role.
So when did you become director?
In 2000.
And what was the situation like that you found when you came in?
Well, I'd been on faculty and I had no intention of being director at all. I loved my teaching and I loved my research, and I had been the associate director for research and graduate programs, which I thought was the best job possible, and I intended to stay in that for life, thank you. But we got into a difficult situation with a former director who hadn't quite worked out, and there was lots of disgruntlement, and then we had a failed search. And in that failed search, the two candidates that came forward were one that was really seen as really emphasizing the teaching side of the house, and the other the research side of the house, and that created a schism. So we had not in anybody's living memory had an internal candidate as director. We'd always had external candidates, and it had been people from the U.S. for 30 years straight. So the revolutionary idea of having an internal candidate is what a few of us talked about and pointed fingers, and I was one of the few associate professors at the time, and decided that it was probably better to step into doing that than to subject ourselves to a situation that wasn't going to work. And to my great surprise, found I loved it.
So what were the big challenges waiting for you when you became director?
It was a complex time of a lot of things changing in the healthcare system. We were starting to move into the changes in the Health Professions Act in BC, the opening up of nurse practitionering, which was a whole new brand of our business. And we opened a program in 2003, so that's fairly shortly into it. But that was the first time that legislation, regulation, and education had all sort of consolidated to create a vision and to develop that program. We all hoped that concurrent with that, we would be able to change the way primary care was delivered in this province. There were lots of federal initiatives to bring some money into it. And BC at that time was really about solo fee-for-service, independent, autonomous primary care physicians paid for out of MSP, and everybody realized that was a dysfunctional way to create a service. Some people have great family doctors, lots of people don't, and there's no coordination, and it's not linked to the rest of the healthcare system. So the assumption was that problem of solving primary healthcare and better aligning it with the healthcare system was going to be a 2 or 3 year project. Well, it's 15 years later and we still haven't solved it. But I had high ideals because I'd actually been on the board of the BC Cancer Agency. I was our professional association's representative on that board, and the board chair at the time that they fired all those boards. But during that time, the oncologists in BC had shifted to become salaried as opposed to fee-for-service. So I'd really been able to see how that worked. They went into it kicking and screaming, most of them, but as soon as it's done, they're happy. I mean, they're a valuable resource. Pay them plenty. It's not about not paying them enough. Pay them plenty, but allow them to do their work on the basis of the clinical need. So I thought that would be a reasonably simple problem, especially since we had all of the bodies coming together to try and solve it. But it causes you to learn a lot about the complexities of how complex systems change very, very slowly.
Well, that's because they have to deal with people. Yeah.
But that's the kind of thing that became very intriguing. And in the role of director of the UBC School of Nursing, you really do have a special position. So a government would look to that kind of person to come in and be part of those kinds of discussions. That would be the natural linkage at the time. So I'd have opportunities that my colleagues wouldn't necessarily have had, but I could also bring the thinking in the school into where the next adventure would be.
Were you getting supported by the university administration at the time?
Oh yes, absolutely. Martha Piper came in as the president, and she was a dear friend and mentor that whole time, and then later Stephen too. So there were very, very good support at the senior level.
Yeah.
I think that those two presidents in particular had a real fascination for the School of Nursing, and
Well, one of them was more or less associated with it, I guess.
Yes, being a physiotherapist. Yeah. But also Stephen too was also interested, because there's so much of the work that's going on in the School of Nursing that's about social determinants of health and human rights and social justice.
Yeah.
So he had a natural affinity from that point of view, and came and spoke at our events and various things. So I think we felt a tremendous support from them as presidents.
Let's go back a little bit to what your own particular interests are in nursing. I mean, you've done quite a lot of publishing, quite a lot of research. What are your particular interests? And where have you worked as a researcher? What have you done?
I started primarily focusing on chronic illness before chronic illness was a thing. There weren't journals or conferences or anything else. There have always been chronically ill people, but it was kind of an undercurrent at the time that I was a graduate student, and I became absolutely fascinated by what wisdom those who have lived with chronic illnesses over time in our society can have with regard to how we think about and structure and organize healthcare. So the link between these reimbursement systems and the who makes what decisions and how patients get involved and what barriers we set up to prevent people from accessing services absolutely fascinated me.
Yeah.
And so that's really carried me through my career. I mean, the human messy stuff appeals to me, and I spent a long time studying cancer communication because it's such a wonderful place in which terrible misconduct can go on, and we don't even notice it. Or
Cancer communication?
Yeah.
What exactly does that entail?
The things that happen between clinicians and patients with cancer, who are very vulnerable people.
Yeah.
But, a classic example being something like, "There's nothing more we can do," which ought to be that utterance ought to be punishable by death. I mean, it's not a thing you ought to say to any human being. There's no justification. There's no situation in which there's nothing you can do. You may not have a medical option to provide, but the system ought to be able to help every single person at every stage in the disease. So the harm and the anxiety that can be caused in cancer is well understood, but we don't have ways of knowing how to deal with it. So I've been wrestling with that with all kinds of wonderful colleagues at this university. We've had wonderful interdisciplinary teams of people trying to figure out what we can learn, primarily from patients. It's almost always from patients.
Yeah.
But what are the patterns and things we can learn that help us understand, oh my gosh, we've been thinking about this in a certain way. And actually, if we take that layer off, we can do it this way.
So you've been focusing on problems like that?
Yep.
And
the complex, messy stuff of chronic illness, chronic and life-limiting conditions. And what we can learn in the healthcare system about our ideas, our attitudes, our structures, our ideologies, that can make a difference.
So nursing is a lot more than simply taking people's temperatures
Oh,
and
yeah.
deciding what drugs they should use.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And the sort of
Yeah.
psychological and social sides of it.
It's fascinating, and I think UBC in the late 70s and 1980s, one of the stellar people at UBC was Joan Anderson. I don't know if you've run across Joan.
I've been trying to get Joan for some
Yes,
time.
you should interview Joan. She came back in sort of 79, 80, sometime around there, from doing a PhD in sociology, and one of the people who had influenced her was Arthur Kleinman, the medical anthropologist. So she came back with this revolutionary new way of thinking about research. Nursing had been struggling along, tied into quantitative methods of the biosciences at that point, and they weren't really answering the questions. There was not a good match between the things you knew how to do from research method point of view and the things that were really of interest. So she came back and brought qualitative methods at an early point. And she was such a good mentor and teacher that a whole generation of people took up these methods and advance them. So we've been a kind of a center for these new ways of thinking about how to engage in community-based research and social action research and research from a patient perspective. So I think that's what's characterized the kind of work that goes on at UBC. So the stuff my colleagues do is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. At the margins of society, social injustice, health equity stuff.
So the
It's great.
profession itself within the university has changed a lot then, say, over the last 25, 30 years.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, physical care, the bedpan still needs to be given.
Yeah.
But this, we don't think of it as a technical operation as much as an engagement encounter, and an encounter in which somebody's vulnerable, and the mundane aspects of everyday life, a teachable moment, a way of engaging, a way of creating relationships, and also, you know, the things you notice and see and do. So the technical work and the requirements of understanding and being able to see what's going on with patients is still there, but it's very much in a human relational context that you engage. And that's what draws people to nursing these days, and that's what keeps them in.
But it's also developed its scientific side, hasn't it?
Oh yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
You,
Social science and conventional science both come together.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
So, sorry.
I was going to say, and one of the interesting features, this is another part that happened during my directorship, is that we actually moved away from having a conventional 4-year undergraduate program.
No.
So during that time, we had taken in a few people with degrees in something else, but we converted entirely to having an upper division, advanced standing, intensive program. We draw from people who have a baccalaureate degree or more. We've had people with masters and PhDs as well in other disciplines, and in very short order, in a very intensive 2-year program, 20-month program, without stopping for a break. They become highly qualified registered nurses.
A BSN?
Yeah, it's a BSN, and because it's a high prestige program, and it's highly competitive to get in. So we have the privilege of choosing these amazing people who have come not only with academic aptitude already proven, but also with clinical aptitude, and we work hard to measure that and to evaluate that. So they come in and they inspire one another. They all come in with something. They come in with knowledge and skills and background and life experience. And they are so inspiring. They're a very different kind of student.
Are they different today from the nursing students you remember from the 1970s?
Well, I think there was a time that some people went into nursing as a default because mom thinks it's a good idea, or I don't know what else to do. And to be fair, I did too. So I was one of those people who really hadn't formulated a good thought as to what I wanted to do. I just knew I wanted to leave home, and I didn't really want to study too hard. So I'm the best example of a bad decision-making process that ended up being exactly the right thing.
Yeah.
But there were a lot more passive students in the earlier years of my teaching when we had students out of first year. A number had not really developed a passion. They were kind of going through the motions. They were more subdued. They didn't. These guys we have now really push the teachers. If the educators don't know their stuff, they just eat them alive, and they should. So they have high expectations, and they turn out to be wonderful nurses. They're leaders. They're engaged. They're setting the world on fire.
Does that not occasionally create a conflict, though, or some kind of tension between the academic, the scientific, the intellectual side, if you like, of the profession, and the everyday business of, as you said, bedpans? I mean, doesn't that create something of a pull and push in the nurse?
Interestingly, not. You would think it would, but the interesting thing is that these new generation that come into our upper division programs have usually come into nursing because something has caused them to really understand that that's what they want in life.
Yeah.
They've had a dying parent, and they've been through a long palliative care experience, or they've been in a war zone and they've seen what nurses have done in an emergency situation. So they've had range of life experiences, and they really get the fullness of the practice. And interestingly, although they do move into leadership positions fairly quickly as their careers advance because they're so talented and that's seen, they have a passion to stay in clinical practice. And they very often are aligning. We'll get them in doing part-time clinical teaching, but then they're back and forth to practice. So their commitment to that everyday practice world is very strong. And certainly even among our PhD graduates, that part of their life is not something that they're going to give up.
So that perhaps rather old-fashioned idea of nursing as a vocation, that still has some appeal, some application into your profession now?
Yes, I think they don't think of it as a job. I don't think it's I think nursing is a thing you become.
Yes.
And you probably recall Elvie Whitaker, another
Yeah.
one of our wonderful colleagues, who that's what she studied as a graduate student, the socialization of a human being into a nurse. And 60 years later, she's gone back and studied that same class of 1959 that she studied during their sandwich year at VGH. But I think that nursing is the kind of career that really does develop that sense of a passion about it. And when I finished being director, I wasn't ready to retire, but that's the first time for many years I'd had the opportunity to think about what do I actually want to do in this world, and I've got a little bit more time in my career, what do I want to do? And the two things that became extremely clear to me, because people in my role in nursing, there's not that many that are suitable for those sorts of roles. It's hard to fill those positions, so you get lots of offers. And that fortunate position caused me to think about what I really want. And the two things, I wasn't going to take any kind of a job or administrative job if it took me out of nursing, if I had to give up that part that I love.
Yeah.
And the second was, I'm not leaving UBC. This is my home. This is a place that it's so fascinating. It's a wonderful university. It's had so many characters and so many interesting things going on. Why on earth would I want to leave and start up in some new place?
Well, let's talk about that for a little bit. As you step back perhaps from your focus on nursing and you look at the university as a whole and some of the things that have happened during your time here, are there any sort of landmark moments, not necessarily around yourself or your profession, but things that really sort of characterize what life is like at UBC or was like? Any controversies that you remember?
Many controversies. I started it off with Lady Godiva ride protests and things like that. The 70s were years of protests, and there were the women's rights and gay rights and all kinds of things. In the health system there were attempts to take over the boards of various hospitals, and abortion rights were definitely something that nursing got involved in. But I think that during my time there have been quite a few, I seem to get attracted to various kinds of controversies. And I've been on Senate for quite a few years, I don't know, in the 20-something years. And through that time we've had various interesting dilemmas about.
Any that have stuck in your mind in the Senate?
Well, probably the most difficult one that I was involved in was the Japanese student repatriation, because it didn't happen quickly enough for members of the community, and we were trying very hard to move it forward, but it became unfortunately contentious, and as chair of the Tributes Committee, I had to wear some of that, so that was
in the end
difficult.
It all turned out fine.
Oh, it did. It was absolutely wonderful. But there was always that sort of tone of the university hadn't quite done it well enough or quickly enough.
The university was moving at its usual pace.
Yes.
Have you noticed over the time you've been here, and you've been here now for I guess 40 odd years, something like that, student and instructor. Have you noticed a change in the culture of the university, in its values perhaps, in the way it treats minorities, or in the role that's played by women? Has the university changed, evolved in some positive ways, or negative ways for that matter?
I'm inclined to see the positive, and to see those many ways in which it's changed. I certainly see loads of attention to equity issues, for example, in student, staff, and faculty. I think UBC's a place where there's a willingness to dive into the hard issues, freedom of expression that we're dealing with now, and other tough issues that other universities can kind of sometimes step back and wait until they get into some big trouble. We don't always get it right, but I think that there's an attempt to sort of say, how can we do this better? And this has always been a university in which I think that's a viable conversation. I think that there have been some, tricky tensions, the sort of corporate tension, the issues with budget, the challenges of privileging those entities that can find ways of attracting more money than others, and certain sectors of the arts and certainly sectors like nursing don't have the potential to attract for all kinds of technical reasons.
Yeah.
So there's some structural inequities in the university that have made made for some differences in the have and have not faculties.
Right. Do you think that the university is perhaps more accommodating to all those things that happen inside it than it used to be, that it doesn't sort of focus its energies and attention on some at the expense of others?
No, I really do think that over the years it's tried to correct those balances.
Yeah.
So for example, there was a time when the high pressured scholarship and the metrics around scholarship were a pretty strong part of the conversation, and the university is really engaged in the issues of quality of teaching.
Yes.
And I don't think that's going to go away. I think it is deeply embedded in the culture. I think that issues of equity and comfort in the classroom, welcoming environment. I've had the joy and privilege of being involved in various aspects of trying to figure out what our university's responsibility ought to be around truth and reconciliation. And we've had, in recent years, to be able to see units, sort of units that would not think that they had any particular contribution to make in that space, to be able to come together and say, oh, actually we do. There's a thing that we can do. That's been one of the joys in applied science, is to bring together all of our units to say, what is it we all do? What do each of us do? Yeah. Some of our units have been leaders in that area for a long time. Others, it's a very new concept. But how can we all come into this conversation?
You've been chair of the Senate Tribute Committee for at least a dozen years now. Mm-hmm. And that shows, at the very least, great stamina and patience. Are there any events surrounding that? You mentioned the Japanese students.
Yes.
That was one big issue for tributes. Were there any others that you recall? Any decisions made by tributes that you're very proud of in terms of the selection of people to be honoured by UBC?
Yes, I'm trying to think of some specifics, but I think we've made some brave decisions. I think the Senate of UBC is not afraid of controversy, and we have had some controversial figures. Yeah. Times when we knew that they would, spark some dissent on campus, and I think that the Senate and its Tributes Committee have really tried to think about what would this university stand for, and to reflect that range. So there's some that come to mind that you when you see the cases all go forward, you develop your favorites. Yes. And I can't remember their names. I can't believe it. But a couple who were ethnobotanists in the Amazon for their career.
Memory.
Yes.
Memory.
Yes.
And I can't remember
what his name was. Yes.
Elwyn Lewis. Was
yes.
It? Something like that.
Yes. Yeah. Lovely people. Yeah. But the fabulous story about them meeting and kissing in the back row of the chemistry class. I mean, you can't make it better than that.
They were students here, and then they went to Washington, St. Louis, or something like that, and then down in the Amazon.
Yeah. And so to bring them back, and that story of the beginning of this really quite remarkable intellectual partnership over the course of their career, hidden way off in the Amazon, not affecting anything. So that was a great story. And I also was very attached to and of course I can't remember the name again, but the wonderful man who had run into some drug issues while he was a student, because he'd had an injury of some kind and got painkillers, and that led into a situation which he couldn't continue. So he didn't finish his degree, but years later developed the Bottle Depot, and to create some way of legitimizing a way of creating income for people who weren't able to manage an income. And to be able to honor that kind of contribution to society, and for him to be able to come back and tell the story of his time and how he'd lost his way was so inspiring to so many. I think these are the stories of, the famous and the greats are wonderful, and it's wonderful to meet them, but there's some very, very interesting stories as well.
I like that the way that in recent years the Tributes Committee has looked beyond just the obvious academic and intellectual achievements, which are very important, but also the more, not more interesting, but equally interesting aspects of people's lives in society.
Yes, and the different kinds of contributions that people can make.
Yeah.
I think that, it's not always been straightforward. I know the music one, for example. I have very wonderful memories of Alan McEachran when he was the Chancellor, because the Chancellor would always sit on that committee. And he did not have much space for those rock stars and things like that. He didn't like that kind of music, so he would always be quite concerned that he'd have to oversee an event that they were being honored. But, those kind of
he
fun
certainly
memories.
didn't hold back when he had an opinion.
No, loved him. He was such a wonderful attribute to the. Of course, all our chancellors have been, but he special soft spot for him.
Yes. So, looking back over your time at the UBC, Sally, and thinking about what you've done here, how would you look at? I'm going to ask you to talk about your achievements; those speak for themselves. But what stands out for you as the sort of the highlights in terms of the things that, either in terms of your departmental life or your researcher's life or your life with colleagues? What kinds of things stand out for you as highlights?
Well, I've always felt the UBC's given me the freedom to have the career that evolved in the way that it needed to. In all of the roles that I've had when I was a professor and then director and then associate dean, I've had quite a lot of license to make those choices as they came along. And I think that to me, I've never been a very good 10-year plan kind of person. I've stayed at the same university, so you'd think I couldn't stand change, but I actually really appreciate the opportunity to be in the world and to see an opportunity as it comes, to be able to make that choice myself as to whether I do or don't want to engage. And so many of those things that I would never have put into a 10-year plan had I created them have turned out to be the most inspirational and joyful. And so many of them are, even the little projects. You get together in a working team for a while at UBC and the Student Ad Hoc Senate Committee on Mental Health, for example. What a wonderful committee to bring together so many parts of the university, and always chaired by brilliant students who kept all of the rest of us in line. But to really dig into the depth of what a university like this could do on behalf of mental health. And then you add to that the arrival of a president who's made a very, very clear personal commitment to that agenda. I think we've got the ability to be able to demonstrate something to the world.
That's splendid. And one last thing, what do you feel the university has meant to you personally of your long time here? And you've not finished, you've still got lots to contribute, Sally, so I'm not asking you to put up your obituary yet, but what has it meant to you?
Well, I'm very, very proud to be a UBC faculty member. At this stage in my life, I get to travel all over the world, and I'm sort of old, and they can bring me up and put me in front of a podium when I speak. But I get to see the respect that this university has all over, and I can take that as a source of pride. But I just feel that I have had the luckiest career. As I say, I have fun every day, and they pay me a salary. How great is that? And I know lots and lots of colleagues who have never had that feeling of satisfaction in the place they work. They've never felt appreciated. I've had so much of a sense of being appreciated in this university. It acknowledges its own. It's a place that can celebrate accomplishments. So to me, I can't imagine having enjoyed a career at a better place.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun talking to you, and thank you for what you've done for UBC over the years as well.
Well, thank you for saying so.